Imagine if you could go into your boss's office and tell him unless you get a raise, he's fired. It sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly how government workers' unions operate. Unions are not necessarily bad. Private sector unions, when not given special privileges by government, can help fairly negotiate to get their members the wages they deserve. But once a union is able to run its own shop, and when they do so at taxpayers' expense, it hurts everyone else for their benefit alone. Here's how it works. Government workers' unions exert massive political influence. They're a powerful and populous special interest group with a high degree of voter participation, making them a valuable ally for politicians. They use their members' dues on political contributions, phone banks, door-to-door campaigns, and many other ways to support favored candidates. Once a candidate gets elected, they can raise union members' compensation, a reward for their support. That means more dues paid, which means even more political spending, forming a positive feedback loop, further entrenching union control. Exacerbating the situation, while private sector unions have a limit on what they can negotiate for based on company profits, dictated by consumer demand for their product, government workers' unions have no such limit. Government can just choose to tax more to give them more. In fact, government workers' unions have fought extensively to see that happen, lobbying and protesting in support of raising taxes, the opposite of what private sector employees like to see happen with their paycheck. It's not easy to break that positive feedback loop. In Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker sought to weaken collective bargaining powers for government workers' unions. Opponents of Walker's policies managed to force a recall election, which Walker only narrowly survived, winning with 53.1% of the vote. If we want to see government budgets come under control and special interests unable to take advantage of taxpayers' money, that means reining in government workers' unions. To see the damage government workers' unions can cause, watch our video on the sins of teachers' unions. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
George Soros is one of the biggest spending political donors in the world. With a net worth of $25 billion, he has funded the most powerful groups on the American left, including arms of the Democratic Party, ACLU, Center for American Progress, and the presidential campaigns of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. So it's worth understanding who he is and what he thinks. Soros made his initial fortune as a hedge fund manager. He is infamous for breaking the Bank of England by shorting the British pound in 1992, leading to the currency's massive devaluation and a crisis in the British economy. Influenced by philosopher Karl Popper and his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Soros claims to advance Popper's vision of a society averse to totalitarianism. An open society is one that values individual rights and recognizes that because perfect knowledge is impossible, our social institutions ought to be open to new ideas and change. And so, Soros's political and philanthropic operation is called the Open Society Foundations. Later, as Soros's views took a dangerous turn away from Popper, he continued to lay claim to the open society concept. He claims there is a deep-seated conflict between capitalism and open society. He's a proponent of European-style socialism and thinks China has a better functioning government than the United States. Soros takes a concept he calls reflexivity and applies it to capital markets, an idea not taken seriously by most economists. This, he argues, makes it impossible for a market economy to remain stable and justifies government intervention in markets. This turn from Popper has led Soros to fund political groups worldwide determined to destroy free markets. And so this so-called open society Soros claims to want isn't really open at all. Soros funds the Institute for Policy Studies, which has had multiple fellows call openly for violent tactics to destroy the U.S. government. Soros money funded Occupy Wall Street, a movement dominated by anarchist and communist revolutionaries, and whose supporters held up signs saying, "Jews control Wall Street." Soros funded Black Lives Matter, which publicly calls for riots and violence against police officers, and United We Dream, an organization that tries to warn illegal aliens in advance of immigration raids. Perhaps Soros's influence is best summed up in his own words. We are trying to make the world a better place, but that's not always what we accomplish.
I want you to make more money. I want every single American to be as wealthy and comfortable as possible. I'm sure you agree, but we might not agree on what will make that happen. By the close of 2016, about 30 state and local jurisdictions have enacted laws phasing in a $15 an hour minimum wage. There's pressure to enact it in a lot more places, even nationally. But contrary to popular belief, this policy has not and will not succeed in raising wages. Let's talk economics. When it comes to finding out the price of something, you can think of the supply of it and the demand for it intersecting at a certain price at which the market clears. That is, all the available supply is bought. Labor works by that rule. There's a supply of potential employees and a demand to hire them. At a certain wage, the market clears and everyone gets hired. What a minimum wage does is say you can't hire someone at that price, you have to pay them more. By economic law, that means less demand for labor at that price. In English, that's called unemployment. The higher the minimum wage, the greater the unemployment. And it's true that there's a certain wage that's unlivable. We need to solve that. But depriving the poor of any job at all is obviously not the answer. We need to make them capable of earning more, and a low-wage job is the first step to rising up the economic ladder. This isn't just theory. After the city of Los Angeles raised its minimum wage to $15, American Apparel eliminated 500 jobs in the city. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the cost of a $9 minimum wage to be 100,000 jobs. A $10.10 minimum wage would be 500,000. A $15 minimum wage would be 7 million full-time jobs lost. Supporters of more than doubling the national minimum wage can't be faulted for wanting people to live comfortably. They can, however, be faulted for not considering the impact of what they're supporting. If a $15 an hour minimum becomes law, its most enduring legacy will be more entry-level unemployment and poverty, hurting exactly the people it was supposed to help. To learn more, read the full article on our website. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching. When Robert Frost wrote, "Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice," he could have been thinking about historic predictions of climate disasters. Those who foresee a climate apocalypse have alternated between fears of hot and cold since the late 1800s. New York Times, February 24th, 1895. The question is again being discussed whether recent and long-continued observations do not point to the advent of a second glacial period. That view changed by the 1930s. New York Times, May 15th, 1932. Melting polar ice caps to raise the level of seas and flood the continents. But that didn't settle it. By the 1970s, we were right back to global cooling. Washington Post, January 11th, 1970. Get a grip on your long johns, cold weather haters. The worst may be yet to come. That's the long-range weather forecast being given out by climatologists. And that wasn't just a one-off. It was big, all over most major publications for a full decade. And they were scared. A new ice age was supposed to come, and the cold was supposed to freeze crops, causing a food crisis. If you're convinced by the science since then, switching back to warming, so be it. But understand this. The news media have been consistent about fostering panic regarding Earth's climate for over a century, but they've been terribly inconsistent on the doomsday we should be panicking about. To learn more, go to climatedollars.org. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching. Is a flood of money into the nonprofit sector a threat to the Republic? Should charities be forced to reveal their donors? Does the public have a right to know how tax-exempt donations are being used and by whom? Disclosing the source of funds going to organizations may sound like a good idea. It helps avoid the appearance, or reality, of elected officials or advocacy groups being bought and sold by special interests. But what's at stake is not so simple. So-called dark money has a long history of protecting unpopular political speech. In 1956, the state of Alabama sued the NAACP, demanding the names and addresses of donors to that civil rights group. If Alabama had won, it would have been a serious, perhaps violent setback for the civil rights movement. Make no mistake, money is speech. Free speech can't flourish if you can't use money to support causes you believe in. Imagine being allowed to write a book, but not being allowed to spend money to print it. Imagine being allowed to record a web video, but not being allowed to purchase internet access to upload it. Both the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, some of the most important documents in American history, written by our founders, were written anonymously. Why? To avoid personal and political attacks on the authors. The same problem exists today. Whether you're on the right or the left, supporting causes you believe in at any scale too often brings vicious attacks by the other side. In more and more cases, when you give to causes you believe in, the government will reveal your full name, address, occupation, and employer. If dark money were eliminated, imagine what it might mean to live in the Bible Belt and donate to Planned Parenthood, or to live in San Francisco and give to the NRA. Imagine if the shooter of the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs had access to the names and addresses of all that group's donors. If you care about free speech, you need to care about privacy rights too. Attacks on dark money are attacks on your right to give to the controversial causes you choose, without having government disclose your personal information. That's vital to a functioning democracy. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching. 97% is a number you might have heard a lot in the last few years. That's the number of scientists who supposedly believe in global warming theory. That 97% claim is questionable, but let's ask the more important question. Why do we find the idea of consensus convincing at all? The terms global warming skeptic and climate change skeptic are insults, but those who use this line of attack ignore that science only works when there are skeptics. Science is rooted in replicable research and experimentation. A scientist examines an existing set of facts and concocts a theory that explains those facts. He or she makes a prediction to test that theory. If the prediction comes true, that constitutes evidence to support the theory. If the prediction fails, that undermines the theory and the scientist goes back to the drawing board. It doesn't matter whether a scientist is on the payroll of the American Cancer Society or a tobacco company, whether he is a communist or a Jew or a Baptist, beats her spouse or volunteers at a soup kitchen. Only the evidence counts. But what happens when someone gets the evidence wrong and it needs correction? That's what critical peer review, aka skepticism, is for. In biomedical sciences, non-replication rates are estimated to range between 75 and 90%. Venture capital firms now take it for granted that 50% of published academic studies cannot be replicated. Imagine what would be done in those cases if there were no skeptics. Business and medicine would be at a standstill. If climate skeptics end up being correct, those attempting to silence them will go down in history alongside the members of the scientific consensus that in years past agreed that the Earth was the center of the universe, that continental drift was impossible, that canals existed on Mars, and that evils such as white supremacy and eugenics were scientifically true. When told of a publication entitled 100 Authors Against Einstein, Albert Einstein reputedly said, "Why 100? If I were wrong, one would have been enough." Science cannot function if skeptics are harassed and ostracized. When someone is challenging a scientific consensus with facts and logic, that's to be encouraged, not dismissed due to politics. Argument, not anathema, is the way to approach scientific issues surrounding climate change. To learn more, you can read our study on climate change advocacy at climatedollars.org. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
The current round of fear of human-caused global warming really started in the 1970s. Based on the best available surface data, from 1940 to the mid-1970s, global temperatures had been falling, creating fears of another ice age. Around 1977, temperatures suddenly rose. At that time, the reasons for this sudden increase were not known. Some scientists suggested the cause of the sudden warming was an increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that came with the Industrial Revolution. The Climate Research Board appointed an ad hoc study group to examine the impact of greenhouse gases on Earth's temperatures. The study group was headed by the noted American meteorologist Jules G. Cherney. The report published in 1979 was called the Cherney Report. It estimated that, quote, the most probable global warming for a doubling of carbon dioxide to be near 3 degrees Celsius with a probable error of plus or minus 1.5 degrees Celsius, unquote. According to the Cherney Report, there are two components to human-caused greenhouse gas warming. The first component is directly from increased carbon dioxide and is estimated from laboratory experiments to be modest. The second component of human-caused global warming is indirect, a positive feedback from increased atmospheric water vapor, and would be far more powerful than the direct warming from carbon dioxide. Since in 1979 there were no comprehensive measurements of atmospheric temperatures, the estimates in the Cherney Report could not be confirmed or disproven. But since it proposed that the warming starts in the atmosphere, atmospheric warming trends would have to be more pronounced than surface warming trends because much of the energy from atmospheric warming is lost into space. Unfortunately, there was pressure to take action before we understood the problem. Before a method to measure atmospheric temperatures was developed, which could be used to directly test the greenhouse gas warming hypothesis, international organizations were being mobilized to control greenhouse gases that were guessed, to cause global warming. The international solution was to control carbon dioxide emissions. The conflict among scientists as to adequate testing of the hypothesis became very public with the involvement of governmental organizations, and the money started to flow. Thus, the resulting conflict is largely political, not scientific, and financed by governments seeking to control carbon dioxide emissions for political reasons. The U.S. government is heavily involved in financing the position that global warming is dangerous and is caused by industry, transportation, and the generation of electricity by carbon-based fuels. At the same time, independent research efforts are producing evidence that call into question the fear of man-made global warming. Two American scientists, Roy Spencer and John Christie, developed a method to finally measure global atmospheric temperatures, needed to confirm the Cherney Report. For developing the method to calculate atmospheric temperatures, Spencer and Christie have been awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement. But the data they've collected don't confirm the predicted result. Independent researchers have tested the hypothesis against atmospheric temperature data, now extending over 37 years. The assumptions in the Cherney Report are not supported by nature. The failure to find physical evidence supporting the assumptions about global warming is not due to a lack of public funding. Because of the political, not scientific, impact of global warming, the United States alone has spent billions of taxpayer dollars on global warming issues. You can find all the details of our calculations on our website, linked in the description, but from fiscal year 1993 to 2014, total U.S. expenditures on climate change amounted to more than $166 billion in 2012 dollars. By way of comparison, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the entire Apollo program from 1962 to 1973 with 17 missions, 7 of them sending men to the moon and returning them, cost $200 billion in 2012 dollars. In other words, we've spent almost as much on global warming as we spent on the Apollo program. And that's just direct government spending, including tax subsidies. It doesn't count the many billions that represent the cost of government regulations or the jobs that are lost. It's time to finally recognize the shaky science global warming stands on and stop spending massive amounts of taxpayer dollars on a highly questionable hypothesis. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to our channel. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Sometimes conspiracies are real. The gunpowder plot was real. The conspiracy behind the Lincoln assassination was real, as was the Watergate cover-up. But many alleged conspiracies are crackpot fantasies, like the International Jewish Conspiracy, the CIA conspiracy to kill JFK, the 9/11 Truthers conspiracy, and now the worldwide conspiracy by oil companies and their co-conspirators to deny climate change and make billions of dollars while ruining the planet. Here's what you've heard. According to Drexel University sociologist Robert J. Bruhl, there is, quote, a deliberate and organized effort to misdirect the public discussion and distort the public's understanding of climate change, unquote. Bruhl claimed that 91 nonprofit groups, including us, the Capital Research Center, with total revenues of just over $900 million a year, deny climate change and are part of what he calls the climate change counter-movement. Bruhl's claim was cited by environmentalists and news media across the world as evidence of a conspiracy by oil and coal companies and their allies to attain great wealth by destroying the environment. But Bruhl's study measured the total income of those organizations, not their spending, much less their spending on the climate change issue alone. Not on the other issues they engage on, such as taxes, foreign affairs, and whatnot. If an organization spent $1,000 on climate change and $999,000 on other things, Bruhl's number counted the entire million. Not a very accurate way of measuring the true scale of spending on climate change. I directed a project at the Capital Research Center that has spent months working to produce a far more accurate estimate of what conservative groups actually spent on the skeptical side of the climate change debate. After studying these groups' tax filings, their websites, media coverage, and more, we calculate that the annual spending on climate change-related issues of these groups in 2010, the last year Bruhl studied, was no more than 10% of Bruhl's $900 million number. We calculated $81 million. What happens if you use Professor Bruhl's method to calculate the funding of nonprofit groups that work on the other side of the climate change issue? You get a total of $1.7 billion in income, according to American University's Matthew Nisbet. So what did Bruhl have to say about Nisbet's number? He harumphed that Mr. Nisbet's analysis tends to stress the gross amounts available, not spending on specific things, unquote. Exactly, precisely, 100% what Robert J. Bruhl's widely cited study itself did. If there's a conspiracy by oil companies and conservatives to cover up climate change, it's vastly smaller than the conspiracy of those trying to institute restrictive laws and regulations, supposedly to prevent it. And that's before you count the vastly larger amounts of money the federal government spends hyping global warming. The best estimates of federal spending on the issue, based on the government's own data, find that from fiscal year 1993 to 2014, total spending on climate change amounts to more than $166 billion in 2012 dollars. To learn more, including the numbers on both sides of this argument, please go to climatedollars.org. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Bear with me for a moment as I explain the Paris climate deal cobbled together by kleptocrats, dictators, and the Obama administration. It's a treaty committing the world's governments to decisive action, supposedly against climate change. It's also not a treaty so that President Obama could bind the United States to it with the stroke of his pen. It's binding on the new president because it's a treaty, although it's not. It's the law of the land because the U.S. Senate somehow approved it without ever actually voting on it. That's because it's merely an extension of an old treaty that the Senate ratified specifically on the ground that it couldn't be thus extended. The decisive action promised in the treaty that is not a treaty consists of governments, most of them run by dictators and thieves, promising on an honor system to take steps of their own choosing, including steps that are impossible, to change future weather patterns, on penalty of no punishment if they break their word. But if you're not for the Paris Treaty, well, you just don't care about the fate of the planet. Got it? Okay, here's some background. As you may know, experts have sounded the alert about climate change. In the 1890s, the fear was a new ice age. In the 1930s, it was warming. In the early 1960s, it was cooling. Then in 1969, experts warned the White House about the warming that was going to put New York and Washington underwater by the year 2000. In 2008, ABC News had New York underwater by 2015. So to fight the threat of global warming, politicians and bureaucrats gathered at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. President Bush, the first one, had run for president promising to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. So he submitted the Rio Treaty to the U.S. Senate. Senators ratified it in October 1992 on a voice vote with no debate. The treaty wasn't controversial because it was a treaty to get together and make more treaties. It had no effect on its own. 5 years later, when a climate treaty was negotiated at a meeting in Kyoto, Senators Robert Byrd and Chuck Hagel introduced a resolution that said the Senate would not accept any global warming treaty that put all the real burden on so-called developed countries, or that would result in serious economic harm in the U.S. And of course, any treaty would have to be approved by a 2/3 vote of senators, as is true for all treaties. This Byrd-Hagel resolution was specifically aimed at the Kyoto Agreement, and it passed 95 to nothing. Flash forward to 2015. The Obama administration teamed up with the Communist Chinese, the worst human rights violators and the worst environmental criminals in the world, to negotiate a treaty in Paris. The Chinese agreed to do nothing other than the things they'd already been projected to do. The U.S., on the other hand, would have massive cuts in the emissions that supposedly cause global warming. The Chinese and the Obama administration pressured the rest of the world to sign on. The effort was helped by the promise of $100 billion a year in transfers from the economically successful countries to the so-called developing countries, or at least to the ruling classes in those countries. Negotiations in Paris were completed on December 12, 2015. The United Nations Secretary General announced on October 5, 2016, that the agreement had met the threshold and would take effect November 4th. Get it? The treaty had to be okayed before November 8th, because that's when the American people would have their say in the election. Supporters of the treaty declared it to be both Congress-proof and Trump-proof. If you've been listening carefully, you see the problem. The United States cannot be a party to a treaty unless the Senate votes to approve it by a 2/3 vote, and there's been no vote. So, President Obama simply declared it to be ratified. Meanwhile, all those other countries that signed on, they get to decide how much they're cutting, and unlike us, they're on the honor system to keep their promises. And if they do follow through, when so-called energy efficiency measures are included, the cost to the world could be $16.5 trillion by 2030. Those numbers represent spending on global warming that is greater than the combined income of the world's billion poorest people. To sum up, this is what passes for logic in the so-called international community. The idea that the world's governments will cut off their countries' access to affordable energy and modern technology and otherwise impoverish their people, racing against the clock, trying to lock down a deal before the American people could have their say in the 2016 election, the Obama administration, the Chinese, and gaggles of dictators and kleptocrats delivered unto the world the Paris Climate Treaty, which, luckily for us, also isn't a treaty. It would be funny if it weren't so serious. There are several ways the Trump administration can get out of this mess, including by withdrawing from that Rio Treaty of 1992. So we'll see who has the last laugh. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to our channel. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Is there such a thing as a car that's too safe? Your instinct likely says no. We all want ourselves and our families to be safe. But now imagine you could have a car that is absolutely perfectly safe. No one could ever get hurt in it, but it costs $5 million. Is your answer still the same? Now let's imagine you're allowed only to buy the perfectly safe car. Your current car is illegal and can't be on the road. So now you're walking to work or taking the bus. Do you think you'd be happy about this state of affairs? Of course, this example is an exaggeration, but the principles underlying it are in effect today and restrict consumer choice while making cars more expensive. Back in 1965, consumer activist Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. Its claims about the Chevrolet Corvair received enormous media attention. At the time, critics accused Chevrolet of cutting corners on safety measures to make the vehicle more affordable and stylish, which supposedly led to crashes. Congressional hearings were held, and these led to the creation of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. A few years later, a study from Texas A&M University showed the Corvair was actually as safe as its competitors, but by then the damage had been done.
Since then, the calls to get government more involved in regulating automobile safety have grown louder and louder. Before we go any further, let's make a key distinction. The customer ought to be fully informed about the safety of his vehicle purchase. No one disputes this. There's nothing wrong with wanting a safer car. However, a decision to purchase a vehicle doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to weigh the qualities that are important to you, price, safety, comfort, and any other factor that is important. And as economists say, there are trade-offs. You cannot maximize one quality without having an impact on another quality you value. It is a judgment call, one that at the end of the day ought to be yours to make, not the government's. Today there's an organization endorsed by Ralph Nader continuing his work, Consumers for Auto Reliability and Safety, also known as CARS. CARS is on the big government anti-consumer choice side in virtually every subject matter area. It claims to work to protect low and moderate income consumers and used car buyers from unsafe recalled used cars. What CARS really does is protect consumers from themselves. CARS lobbies and testifies before Congress for safer airbags and mandates that all automobiles carry side airbags. It organizes victims, survivors, and family members of victims to speak out in support of auto safety mandates. It brags about driving the French automaker PSA Peugeot Citroën from the U.S. market. CARS led a boycott against Peugeot because the company would not accede to its strict demands on safety measures. One of its targets nowadays is the popular used car retailer CarMax. The group attacks CarMax because it gives buyers the option of purchasing autos subject to recall where the autos have not yet had the recalled items repaired. It says CarMax just doesn't care enough about their customers' safety to do the right thing. CARS has advocated for legislation introduced by Senators Richard Blumenthal and Edward Markey, the Used Car Safety Recall Repair Act, to ban CarMax and others from doing this. Again, there's nothing wrong with wanting a safer car, but the right way to do that isn't by creating government mandates telling consumers what they're not allowed to buy. It's by letting consumers know all the relevant information and letting them decide for themselves. Safety ratings from private organizations such as the IIHS, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which gives cars its top safety pick label based on the ability of a vehicle to protect its occupants during an impact, and crash avoidance is the way forward, not bans that reduce choice and presume to know what each and every driver ought to prefer. If you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.
How many of the people in labor unions ever actually voted to join a labor union? You'd be surprised. This issue was raised recently by a fellow named Terry Bowman. Bowman has worked as an hourly employee for Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan for 20 years. Working for Ford is a tradition in his family. Bowman's father also worked for Ford, so did a brother and several of his aunts and uncles. At Ford, the Bowmans shared something beyond family ties. They were all represented by the United Auto Workers. One day last summer, Bowman congratulated an employee at the plant who was retiring after 50 years on the job. Something amazing occurred to him, that the 50-year employee had been a member of the UAW for half a century, yet never, not once, voted to join the UAW or to have the UAW represent employees at the plant. That decision had been made by other workers a generation before he started working at Ford. Decades later, their choice still bound him and all Ford's current employees. The UAW organized Ford Motor Company in 1941. The automaker's current employees were all hired after 1941. They never voted for UAW representation themselves, but what's called the presumption of majority support means that the UAW never had to win their support in a new election. Most U.S. union members inherited representation this way. For over 2 generations, the Bowmans and all of their co-workers received union representation they never asked for. They're not alone. The vast majority of unionized workers, some 94%, never voted for their union. Unions legally represent workers in workplace negotiations. In theory, this representation is legitimized through a democratic process in which workers vote in favor of union representation. In practice, only 6% of those covered by unions under the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, have ever voted for union representation. 2/3 of workers think union representatives are representing themselves rather than the workers, and 70% of union members disapprove of their union. How did we get to this situation? 4 aspects of the union election procedures cause this problem. 1. Unions can bypass workplace elections entirely by pressuring employers to forego a secret ballot. The National Labor Relations Act allows employers to request a secret ballot before it requires them to recognize and bargain with the union. But unions will wage public relations campaigns against corporations until the company agrees to forego a secret ballot vote. 2. When employees do vote, unions need not obtain the support from a majority of employees in the workplace. It's sufficient to get a majority of workers voting in the election. For example, in August of 2015, workers at the Link Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas voted on whether to join the UAW. The UAW got 74 votes. 42 workers voted against it, and 131 did not vote. The UAW won the election despite the fact that fewer than 1/3 of all employees voted for representation by the UAW. 3. Once formed, unions do not stand for re-election. They remain certified indefinitely unless removed in a decertification election. This stands in stark contrast to political representation. Political representatives in America serve for a fixed term of office. Their election gives them a mandate to represent their constituents, but that mandate lasts only a fixed period of time. Union representation does not operate on this principle. 4. The National Labor Relations Board makes it difficult to call for decertification elections. Unions likewise work to prevent decertification. Most unions expel members who support decertification, and the NLRB regulations create a system in which workers typically have just 1 month every 3 years to petition for a new election. This system makes unions less accountable to their members. Workers who want a different union representative or no union face considerable difficulty in implementing these preferences. Unions know this, so they feel less pressure to represent their members well. Some unscrupulous unions take advantage of this situation to pursue their institutional interests at the expense of their members. Currently, union representation in the United States is uncomfortably close to that envisioned by dictators who come to power initially by election. 1 man, 1 vote, once. Or, as Turkish strongman Erdogan reputedly said, democracy is like a bus. Once you reach your destination, you get off. We don't elect presidents for life. We shouldn't elect unions for life, or for the lives of people who aren't even born. It's time for America's workers to benefit from the same democratic process that made our nation great. If you like this video, please click the links on your right to read the full story on our website and subscribe to us on YouTube. And check out the description below to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
In a recent survey about poverty from the American Enterprise Institute, there was a question that asked, even if the government were willing to spend whatever is necessary to eliminate poverty in the United States, do you think the government knows enough about how to accomplish that or not? When that question was asked to those in poverty themselves, 71% agreed that government did not know how to accomplish that task. This was striking to me because the question asked specifically if elimination of poverty was possible even if raising spending was not an issue, and people still believed it could not be accomplished. I agree with the people that were asked this question, and my personal experience in aiding those in poverty explains why. Many years ago, I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I volunteered to go to parts of South Carolina and Georgia to teach people the gospel of Christ. As missionaries, we talked with many people and just went about helping others. I spent this time mostly around people who were in poverty. One day, my companion and I were out knocking on doors. When we reached a dilapidated house, a man opened the door and allowed us to come in to teach him about our beliefs. We introduced ourselves, and he said his name was George. In the home, we could see that his living conditions were primitive. We tried to speak to him, but we noticed that he had some difficulty with concentration. George seemed to suffer from some kind of mental health issue. We invited him to church and left his home thinking about his condition. After we left, my companion and I called our local bishop and told him about George. The bishop then called other members of the church to provide food for him. On Sunday, we saw that George accepted our invitation to church, and he met many local congregation members there. People in the ward would come up to my companion and me and say, "I met your friend Andy, he's a nice man," or "I met your friend Sam." This was confusing to us because we didn't invite anyone named Andy or Sam to church. We soon realized that these mystery people were in fact George. It was in this moment that I realized the extent of his dementia. He would introduce himself with different names when meeting people. Throughout the following weeks, George made contact with some people in the local congregation. George's mental illness made it difficult for him to work or to go out to receive assistance himself. In this experience, it is important to note that George was not only helped, but that he now belonged to a community that looked out for each other. In the LDS Church, we have a program called home teaching or visiting teaching. This is when we go to check up on each other regularly to see how others in the church are doing. If someone lost a job or someone was struggling in some way, then there would be those friends and acquaintances that would be able to help during that difficult time. It wouldn't make sense for George to get to know us missionaries only for us to leave the area and put him back where he was. George needed that connection to local people who would follow up and make sure he is okay. I have reflected on this moment many times since meeting George years ago. I don't know who else would have found and helped George if we were not lucky enough to knock on his door. I only knew him for about a month until I moved away from the area, but it left an impression that has stayed with me. Those with mental illnesses are not getting proper treatment mostly because they live outside of normal society. People do not see them. Mental illness is an enormous challenge that leaves many in poverty. These people face higher healthcare costs, higher unemployment, and greater challenges to self-sufficiency. We as missionaries are not trained to help in this regard, but these concerns are brought to the bishop, who is able to find proper channels to help those with mental illness. Private charities, churches, and local individuals are better suited to helping those in poverty than government bureaucracy. These local people can ascertain the individual problems of poverty in the community, and they know more about local resources to help aid those who are impoverished. As in the American Enterprise Institute survey, the poor don't believe that throwing more money at government programs is going to help them. The reason I discovered why is that government cannot create the essential characteristics of community that are vital for helping them. Private people have local contextualized knowledge about the circumstances of individuals in poverty that the government does not and cannot possess. My experience was with the LDS Church, but any private charity, organization, or individual can use the same tactics to alleviate poverty. If we want to see the conditions of the worst off improved, that means all of us need to get out and take action, not expect government to be able to do it for us. If you liked this video, please click on the link to your right to read an article by Melody Bowler and I about Christ Central Ministries, a South Carolina charity doing good work in many similar ways to what I discussed in this video. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, here to talk about an article by Olivia Grady. If you had to think of someone who was the ideal example of what it means to be a good person, who would it be? It would probably be someone who lives their life to help the disabled. It would probably be good for society to help that person in return, right? Unfortunately, the government and the Service Employees International Union are fighting against that. In Minnesota, home care providers, also known as personal care assistants, PCAs, are individuals, usually family members, who take care of disabled persons at home and who are employed by those for whom they care. They receive a small Medicaid subsidy to assist in their efforts. In May 2013, after the longest legislative debates in state history, the Minnesota legislature passed the Individual Providers of Direct Support Services Representation Act, and Governor Mark Dayton signed the bill into law, declaring that for the purposes of the Public Employment Labor Relations Act, individual home care providers shall be considered executive branch state employees. In other words, PCAs, people who provide home care to the disabled, usually family members, are state employees in Minnesota, but only for the purposes of their possible representation by unions and collective bargaining. And so in August 2014, after a vote in which only 21.7% of Minnesota PCAs participated and just only half of them voted yes, SEIU Healthcare Minnesota became the exclusive bargaining representation for all the PCAs. If they bargained successfully and got PCAs more money, hey, not so bad. So what if most of them didn't vote for the union? Unfortunately, all the SEIU ended up doing was collecting dues from PCAs and eating up 3% of the subsidy they get and need to survive on. Chris Green is a 5-year PCA in the Lakeville area of Minnesota. The mother of a daughter with a disability, she's taken care of her daughter for over 24 years. She appreciates the Medicaid subsidy. She does not want the union to come between her and the care of her daughter. She wrote in a newspaper op-ed, "On June 10, 1992, I gave birth to my daughter Meredy. She was a beautiful baby girl. My husband Dave and I couldn't have been happier or prouder. When we were told that Meredy suffered from Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome, we knew we were in for some unique challenges, but we also knew having her in our lives was more than worth it. 5 years ago," she wrote, "I joined a Minnesota program and became a personal care assistant, PCA, to my daughter. Though I had been caring for her entire life, joining this PCA program allowed us to receive a modest Medicaid subsidy to assist in her care. It also allowed Meredy to live at home instead of in a government-run institution. My husband and I consider this public support a generous gift that we have not taken for granted and for which we are very grateful. Meredy continues to live at home with us, where we know she is happy and safe under our care, instead of with a stranger who may or may not have her best interests at heart. I don't need a union to help me take care of my daughter, and I don't need a union taking 3% of our money." Unquote. Green sued the SEIU, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But with only 8 members on the court, after Justice Scalia's death, the court deadlocked. Unfortunately, decertifying a union is much more challenging than certifying one. But Green is trying. If this is an issue that affects you, check out mnpca.org to join her fight. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to subscribe to our channel and read the full story on our website. Thanks for watching.
Obamacare has transformed American healthcare. The changes have benefited some Americans, but the law's vast expansion of the welfare state has stuck many other Americans with the bill. Premiums are up 22%, and the penalty for not having insurance under the individual mandate can be more than $2,000. Unfortunately for many Americans, paying that penalty is still a better deal than purchasing the high-end insurance that Obamacare demands. So, until Obamacare is completely repealed and all its regulations fully rolled back, what can Americans struggling to get insurance outside of Obamacare exchanges do? Option 1, short-term health insurance. That's the closest thing out there to pre-Obamacare health insurance. It provides no coverage for pre-existing conditions, nor does it cover things like preventative care, mental health services, and maternity care. But it does allow you to buy cheap plans with less service if you don't want or need more expensive Obamacare-compliant plans. Option 2, cash clinics. These have exploded over the past few years, and these clinics take only cash or credit cards. Unlike most healthcare providers, cash clinics are upfront about their pricing. And since they have to compete with more conventional clinics, cash clinics have an incentive to keep costs down. Neither of these options are an ideal healthcare solution, but for many Americans, they're better than the Obamacare plans the government hopes to force on them. Unfortunately for consumers, you still have to pay the individual mandate fine. So, what about those who want to opt out of Obamacare entirely? They can go with option 3. So-called health shares run by faith-based groups have become popular over the past few years. In these arrangements, members pay monthly contributions that go into their share box, and when a member submits an eligible bill, it's paid out of multiple members' share boxes. In other words, health sharing functions more or less like a conventional insurance program, but it's technically not insurance. Under one organization's plan, if health share applicants are overweight or suffer from manageable pre-existing conditions, they'll be asked to agree to enroll in HealthTrack. HealthTrack enrollees pay an additional fee to work with a coach who helps them make lifestyle choices such as changing diets and setting realistic goals. Once the health goals are achieved, the participant can leave the program. Most importantly, members of Liberty HealthShare and other faith-based organizations don't have to pay Obamacare fines. Alas, that has not stopped state regulators from trying to outlaw health shares programs. These innovative opt-out options could lay the foundation for an entirely new healthcare system. Health sharing isn't much different from the mutual aid societies that existed before most of them suffered death by regulation under FDR. Two well-known mutual aid societies were the Elks Lodges and the Knights of Columbus. In exchange for monthly dues, the organization covered medical expenses and provided other benefits. These sorts of market-based innovations are the solution to Obamacare, and they'd exist more abundantly, as they did in the past, if our overzealous government didn't think it knows enough to dictate what healthcare solution is best for every single one of us, regardless of our unique circumstances. Greater freedom to choose our healthcare wouldn't lead to people dying on the street because they can't afford insurance. Instead, freedom would lead to the exact opposite. Those who are struggling financially would actually be able to afford the care they need. If you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up below and hit the links on your right to subscribe to our channel and read the full story on our website. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Matthew Vadum here on behalf of Tina Trent to talk about her article, The Southern Poverty Law Center's Trump Effect Deception. On November 29, 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center and other so-called civil rights groups met at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and called on President-elect Donald Trump to immediately and forcefully publicly denounce racism and bigotry, and to call on Americans to stop all acts of hate. But what acts of hate were they talking about? The hate that they invented. Let me explain. The SPLC released the results of a survey answered by more than 10,000 teachers across the country, detailing the negative effect the election has had on school climates, a phenomenon dubbed the Trump effect. The center has long claimed that the nation is boiling over with hatred and intolerance. Decades after the civil rights movement forever changed America, and despite the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the imposition of affirmative action, American race relations are always worse today than in the days of Jim Crow. The SPLC claims that its survey is evidence of a tidal wave of hate speech, vandalism, and threats directed at minority school children by their peers who support Trump. Every social ill, from bullying to poor grades to tummy aches to suicidal thoughts, may now be attributed to the Trump effect. Much like witchcraft, Trump is supposedly such a powerful influence that he induces nausea and crying fits in grade schoolers and among teachers. In a triumph of psychological projection, even beating the snot out of Trump supporters is now Donald Trump's fault, because the Trump effect infects everyone with aggression, regardless of the content of their character or their politics. And even preschoolers have politics now. A portion of the Trump Effect report is dedicated to complaints by preschool teachers that the toddlers in their care are engaging in uncivil discourse because of Donald Trump. Here are 3 typical responses submitted by teachers. A lot of our students from historically marginalized identities, e.g. Muslim, people of color, and LGBTQ plus identified folks, are truly scared for their lives if Trump were elected. The call for return to slavery, indentured servitude, by some has been astounding, but has not seemed to shock my students. Heightened distinction between ethnic groups with stereotyping and discrimination. We just studied the Holocaust, so it's refreshing to see the comparisons students are making between Donald Trump and Hitler. What? It's crude propaganda, but that's par for the course. The Southern Poverty Law Center is an attack machine funded by far-left philanthropies and individual donors who want to move America dramatically to the left. Anyone who doesn't subscribe to the center's hyper-politically correct views is deemed racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or Islamophobic. The SPLC accused the American Enterprise Institute, the influential mainstream conservative think tank, of links to racism just because it employed conservative intellectual and filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza. AEI is part of an array of right-wing foundations and think tanks that support efforts to make bigoted and discredited ideas respectable, the center stated, but the center was unable to come up with real examples of bigotry or racism. Instead, the center called legitimate lines of intellectual inquiry bigoted and dishonestly misrepresented AEI's views. D'Souza, who rails against affirmative action and racial preference policies, is a dark-skinned immigrant to the U.S. from India who speaks with an accent. But to the center, he is a scholar whose views are seen by many as bigoted or even racist. Notice the use of weasel words here. Instead of presenting actual facts, the SPLC says D'Souza is seen by many. The group claims the principal enemies of the American people are people like Donald Trump. The center characterizes all opposition to immigration and open borders as symptomatic of hate, and all political expression of those views to be hate speech. In other words, if you disagree with this group, you are evil and worthy of public condemnation. It may take some intellectual toughness to insist that the nation has the right to decide who may or may not cross its borders, but it's not hate. Donald Trump wants to restrict immigration, deport illegal aliens, and enforce the law, so in the center's eyes, he is a hate monger. The fabulously wealthy 501c3 nonprofit has an astounding $1/3 of $1 billion, or $338 million, in assets, as well as bank accounts in offshore tax havens, Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands. If the SPLC is involved in something, chances are it's a scam. With the SPLC, the point isn't to actually disavow prejudice, but to monetize it. It's media gold whenever Trump reiterates for the umpteenth time his forceful disavowal of racism. Media outlets from MSNBC to NPR then take to the airwaves to disavow Trump's disavowal, and another entire news cycle becomes about speaking truth to power regarding Trump's supposedly persistent racism problem. The mainstream media eagerly picks up these specious allegations and reports them as news. Thus do unsubstantiated rumors become documented incidents become official reports, and official reports become a purported tidal wave of hate blared in headlines across the nation. What about the real tidal wave of slurs, threats, riots, property damage, and beatings carried out by anti-Trump activists? Silence. There's big money in claiming our schools are awash with 9-year-old white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and government education funding is the only money the SPLC can still skim off taxpayers these days. If you liked this video, please click the links on your right to read the full story on our website, and subscribe to us on YouTube, and check out the description below to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Thanks for watching.